The morning light sliced through the blind slats with that particular cruelty, illuminating every dust mote floating in the still air of the workshop. Elias awoke in the rocking chair where he had fallen asleep, his body protesting the awkward position, stiff joints reminding him that his 65 years weighed far more than they should. 3 days had passed since the doctor had uttered the words, with that professional kindness he had already learned to despise. A week, perhaps less. The degeneration that had already stolen the steadiness from his hands now came for his eyes, and this time there were no experimental treatments, no hopes wrapped in technical terms he barely grasped. He rubbed his face with rough palms, feeling the stubble scratch his skin, and let his eyes sweep across the workshop like a condemned man observing his last meal. Every surface told an abandoned story. The oak shelf he had promised the local church priest, the table legs that never received a finish, the crib begun when he still harbored illusions of other grandchildren, other chances. The surrounding wood was a graveyard of intentions, each board and every beam a promise his traitorous hands could not honor. The scent of old sawdust permeated everything, mingled with the odor of oxidized varnish and that characteristic dampness of wood long awaiting its purpose. Tools hung on the walls like surgical instruments in an abandoned operating room, each polished by decades of use, each now too heavy for his hands that trembled even at rest. He looked at them with something between gratitude and resentment, as if looking at old friends who had abandoned him when he needed them most. It was then that his eyes fell upon the box in the farthest corner of the workshop, covered by a tarp that had been there so long it had become part of the place's very landscape. Elias rose with effort, each movement a negotiation with the body that no longer obeyed as it once did, and walked toward it. His hands trembled as he pulled back the tarp, revealing the wood that had slept beneath it for 15 years. Brazilian rosewood, the noblest piece he had ever owned, acquired when he still had plans, when he still believed the future would be generous. The wood gleamed even beneath the accumulated dust, its dark veins snaking across the surface like rivers viewed from high above, its density promising a resonance that would make even the dead pay heed. He ran his fingers over the uneven surface, feeling each imperfection, every promise contained within those fibers awaiting liberation. His hands trembled even more as he lifted the first board, not from its weight, but from the enormity of the decision he had made without even realizing the exact moment it formed in his mind. A cello. His last work would be a cello, and it would be for Sofia, the granddaughter he hadn't seen since she was 7 years old, since the funeral where the silence between them had become something solid and insurmountable. The memory arrived unbidden, as it always did in those days. Elena in the coffin, so young it seemed obscene, and Sofia clinging to his leg, so small her crying seemed to come from somewhere far deeper than that fragile body. He had tried to speak, tried to offer some comfort, but the words died before birth, strangled by his own grief. And in the days that followed, in the weeks and months, the silence between them grew like a poisonous plant, fed by his inability to express anything, and by the resentment he saw growing in the girl's eyes. Sofia had been taken away by her father's family, the man Helena had chosen, and whom Elias had never fully accepted, and then she simply vanished from his life, present only in the photographs that still covered an entire wall of the workshop, her face frozen at 7 years old, while somewhere in the world she grew up without him, became a woman without him witnessing it, carried resentments he could barely imagine, but felt like a stone in his chest. 22 years now. He knew because he still received the birthday cards he sent back unopened, saw her name on social media, which he didn't understand, but Helena had taught him to use in the last months before she died. Sofia at 22, with her mother's face, but something harder around her eyes, something he recognized as his own distorted reflection. Elias placed the wood on the main workbench, the surface he knew better than his own face, scarred by decades of cuts and scratches, each imperfection a record of past work. He took from his shirt pocket the glasses he now wore all the time and leaned over the wood, studying it with the intensity of a man who knows he is reading the final pages of a precious book. A cello was no simple task, even on his best days, even when his hands obeyed and his eyes perceived every detail with crystal clarity. It would have taken months, perhaps a year. But he didn't have months. He had days. Less than a week before the world transformed into permanent darkness, before his hands became even more useless without the guidance of sight. It would be impossible, of course. Any sensible person would tell him that. But Elias had spent his life transforming dead wood into living beauty. And if he was to leave a final testament to his existence, let it be this: an impossibility realized, a gift for the granddaughter who hated him, an apology carved in rosewood and varnish. He picked up the pencil, the tool that least betrayed his trembling hands, and began to trace lines on the wood. Each curve of the cello materialized on the tracing paper he had placed over the dark surface, the proportions emerging from somewhere deep within his memory, where he still held the recollection of having watched a luthier worked decades ago in a workshop that no longer existed. The body of the instrument first, the sensual curve that would allow the wood to breathe and sing. The F-holes, those elegant cuts that looked like cursive signatures in the wood, through which the sound would escape like a liberated soul. The elongated neck, where Sofia's fingers would one day dance, if she ever forgave enough to accept the gift, if she ever learned to play, if so many unforeseeable conditions ever aligned. Hours passed unnoticed. The sun shifted position. Shadows in the workshop rotated like the hands of a gigantic clock, and Elias remained hunched over the workbench, drawing and redrawing, measuring with instruments he had to hold with both hands to keep steady, calculating proportions that depended as much on mathematics as on instinct. His mind wandered as he worked, gliding through memories like hands over polished wood. Helena, as a girl, no older than Sofia when he lost her, standing in this very workshop as he taught her to feel the direction of the grain, to respect the wood's nature instead of forcing it. Helena laughing as he explained that each tree had its own personality, that oak was stubborn but honest, that pine was generous but needed guidance, that rosewood was noble and demanded reverence. She had talent, his daughter, skilled hands and an eye for proportion, but she had chosen another path, chosen a man and a life far from sawdust and varnish, and he had never known if he was proud or hurt by it. And then she had died too young, and all the conversations they might have had remained trapped in silence, and Sofia was left alone with a grandfather who did not know how to love out loud. Afternoon turned into night, and Elias had to turn on the workshop lights, those yellowish lamps that transformed everything into shades of amber and shadow. He worked under that light, which seemed to come from another time, his hands moving with a determination that transcended the tremor, guided by decades of muscle memory and by the urgency that only a deadline can confer. When he finally stopped, his back screaming in protest and his eyes burning from the effort of focusing, the first sketches were complete. They were not perfect. The lines trembled in some places. The measurements would have to be rechecked. But there it was, the ghost of a cello, waiting to be freed from the wood that imprisoned it. Outside, the rain began. First a few drops exploring the zinc roof, then a growing drumming that soon turned into a full deluge. The sound was deafening and comforting at the same time, reminding him of thousands of other nights spent in this workshop, working as the world outside dissolved into water. Elias moved away from the workbench and walked to the window, watching the rain transform the backyard into a blur of darkness and reflections. How much longer could he see the rain, How many more storms would he witness before the world closed in permanent darkness? He tried to memorize every detail, every drop that ran down the glass, every reflection of light in the puddles forming. He returned to the rocking chair, his body exhausted, but his mind strangely awake. The sketch on the workbench seemed to glow even in the dim light, a promise not yet fulfilled, but already embraced. His hands ached, but it was a different pain than he had known in recent years. It was the pain of work, of purpose, of creation in progress. The smell of sawdust enveloped him like a blanket, mingled with the sound of rain and the weight of memories. He closed his eyes, not to sleep yet, but to feel everything more intensely, to engrave each sensation before time stole even that from him. When sleep finally came, it found him still in the chair, surrounded by tools and promises, by photographs of faces he had loved, and by a piece of rosewood awaiting transformation. The rain continued its song against the roof, and for the first time in years, Elias slept with something beyond resignation in his heart. He slept with purpose. The gray morning light found Elias already standing, his trembling hands holding the first plane against the rough surface of the rosewood. There was no coffee brewed, no breakfast on the kitchen table, only the man and the wood, united by the urgency of time that slipped through his fingers like fine sawdust. The first movement was a disaster. The blade bit into the wood at the wrong angle, tearing off an irregular splinter that leaped through the air like a wounded bird. Elias held his breath, feeling the tremor in his hands intensify with frustration. His arm muscles protested, stiff from the poorly slept night in the chair, from years of progressive degeneration that had transformed his tools into instruments of torture. But he did not stop. He repositioned the plane, closed his eyes for an instant, and let 40 years of muscle memory take control. The second attempt was better, the third better still. Soon, thin spirals of wood began to fall at his feet, like petals of an impossible flower, each one carrying the sweet scent of rosewood, each one stealing a little more of the vision he had left. Every 10 minutes, Elias had to stop. His hands wouldn't obey, his fingers clenched in involuntary spasms, and pain climbed from his wrists to his shoulders like liquid fire coursing through his veins. During these forced pauses, he wouldn't rest. He ran his fingertips over the wood, memorizing each fiber, every imperfection, each promise hidden within its texture. He closed his eyes and saw with his hands what he would soon no longer be able to see with his eyes. It was during one of these pauses that the first memory struck him with the force of a physical blow. Helena was 5, perhaps 6, and stood beside the workbench, too small to reach the surface without the aid of the stool he had built especially for her. Her dark hair fell over her shoulders in disheveled curls, and her eyes shone with that fierce curiosity she would never lose, not even in her last days. Elias had placed 3 pieces of wood before her: mahogany, cedar, and epee. "Touch," he had said. "Don't look, feel." And Helena had closed her eyes, small hands tracing each surface with a concentration that seemed too vast for such a tiny body. Her long fingers, so like his own, so like Sofia's, danced over the different textures. "This one is warm," she had said, touching the cedar. "This one is a friend. And this one, holding the epee. This one is strong. This one doesn't forget." Elias opened his eyes in the empty workshop, years after that afternoon, and realized tears were streaming down his face. He wiped them away with the back of his hand, staining his skin with sawdust and salt, and returned to his work. The cello's body began to emerge from the raw wood, like a creature being born from amber. It wouldn't be perfect, Elias knew that. Each stroke of the plane carried the tremor of his ailing hands. Every curve revealed the limitations of a body slowly giving up. But there was something there, something that transcended the impeccable technique of his years of glory. There was honesty in the imperfection, truth in the irregular lines. The illness had begun 15 years ago, right after Helena's funeral. Elias remembered the exact day. He was in the workshop, trying to work, trying to find in the wood the solace he couldn't find anywhere else. He had picked up a tool, a simple chisel he had used thousands of times, and noticed his right hand trembled. Just a slight tremor, almost imperceptible. He had ignored it. The next day, the tremor was worse. The following week, both hands. The next month, the pain had started. The doctors spoke of degenerative processes, of autoimmune diseases, of possible treatments. Elias listened to it all with the distant expression of someone who no longer fully inhabited his own body. Part of him understood, with a terrible clarity, that his body had simply decided to surrender. Elena was gone, and he hadn't found enough reasons to continue whole. But he had kept working. He had accepted smaller commissions, simple projects his trembling hands could still complete. He had sold old pieces, relics from the times when his hands were firm and his heart still knew how to beat with purpose. He had survived, nothing more than that. He had merely survived. And Sofia, the girl who had appeared at the funeral at 7 years old, holding her maternal aunt's hand, her eyes too dry for a child, her face such a perfect replica of Elena's that Elias felt the air leave his lungs. He had tried to approach, tried to reach out, but the words wouldn't come. He had merely stood there, 3 meters away, watching the child watch him back, with something that could have been curiosity, or could have been accusation. After the funeral, there had been a few attempts. The maternal aunt had called 2, perhaps 3 times, suggesting visits, suggesting Sofia needed to know her grandfather, that the girl asked questions about her mother only he could answer. Elias had promised, postponed, invented excuses that sounded weak even to his own ears. And then he had stopped answering the phone. It wasn't cruelty. He repeated it to himself on sleepless nights, when the pain in his hands kept him awake, and the guilt felt worse than any physical symptom. It wasn't a lack of love. It was self-preservation, in the most cowardly way possible. Every time he looked at Sofia, he saw Elena. He saw his daughter at 5, learning to feel the wood. He saw his daughter at 10, building her first music box. He saw his daughter at 17, saying she would study literature because words too could build worlds. And Elias laughed, saying she had inherited the soul of an artist even if she didn't follow in his footsteps. Seeing Sofia was bleeding from wounds that would never heal, so he simply stopped seeing her. The sun reached the middle of the sky as Elias worked, though he barely noticed. Sweat ran down his face, mixing with the sawdust that clung to his skin. His hands trembled so much he had to stop 3 times just to hold the tool properly. But the form kept emerging. The sensual curves of the cello's body, the elegance of the top, the F-shaped openings that looked like 2 mirrored questions in the wood. It was while searching for a specific piece of sandpaper in the workbench's bottom drawer that he found the letter. The envelope was yellowed, its edges worn by time. Elias immediately recognized the handwriting on the front, his own, addressing the letter to Helena. But the letter had never been sent. He didn't remember having stored it there, didn't even remember having written it. But upon opening the envelope with fingers that trembled for reasons unrelated to his illness, he discovered he had been mistaken. The handwriting was Helena's. The date at the top of the page indicated it had been written 3 months before her death. Elias sat heavily in the chair, the envelope forgotten on the floor, his eyes scanning words that seemed written in a foreign language, so impossible they appeared. She spoke of Sofia, of how the girl had hands that seemed made to create, how sometimes she picked up pencils and drew things she shouldn't be able to draw at just 7 years old. She spoke of how she wished Elias knew his granddaughter better, how she was sure the two of them would understand each other, how there would be so much he could teach her. And then, in the last paragraphs, Helena wrote about her own illness, of how she knew there were no more treatments, no more hope, of how she needed Elias to promise something, a final promise from father to daughter. Take care of her, Father. When I leave, and I will leave soon, don't leave her alone. She will need you. She will need to know that Bart didn't die with her mother, that beauty still exists, that hands can create even when the heart is broken. Promise you won't pull away. Promise you'll teach her what you taught me. Promise you'll love her, even if loving hurts, especially when loving hurts. Elias held the letter against his chest, the words burning through the thin paper, through his skin, directly into the empty center where his heart used to beat with purpose. 15 years. 15 years he had kept this letter unread, or perhaps he had read it and forgotten, his mind doing what it does best when the pain is too great. Erasing, burying, protecting. 15 years of broken promises. The tears came then, finally, inevitably. Not just silent tears streaming down his face, but sobs that shook his entire bowed body, that tore wounded animal sounds from his throat, that made his hands tremble even more violently. He cried for Helena, for the girl with disheveled curls touching wood with her eyes closed, for the woman who had died asking for the one thing he hadn't been able to give. He cried for Sofia, for the abandoned 7-year-old child, for the 22-year-old woman who had grown up without knowing she had a grandfather who loved her from afar. Cowardly, insufficiently. He wept for himself, for the man who once crafted beauty with steady hands and a whole heart, and who now could barely hold a tool, without pain reminding him of all the ways he had failed. The sun began its descent across the sky, painting the workshop in shades of orange and gold. Light streamed through the dusty windows in solid shafts, illuminating the sawdust particles that floated in the air like microscopic stars. Elias remained seated, the letter pressed against his chest, gazing at the half-finished cello on the workbench. It wasn't perfect. It never would be. The lines bore the tremor of his hands. The curves revealed the limitations of a body giving way. But there, in that golden light, in that honest imperfection, lay something more precious than technical perfection. There was love. There was regret. There was a promise being finally, belatedly, painfully fulfilled. He stood up, tucked the letter into his shirt pocket directly over his heart, and returned to work. His hands remembered what to do, even as they trembled. They remembered because true art doesn't live solely in muscles and nerves. It lives somewhere deeper, somewhere illness cannot reach, cannot destroy. Night was approaching. 2 days of sight remained, perhaps less, but the cello was taking shape, born of wood and guilt and unspoken love. And for the first time in 15 years, Elias worked not to survive, not to forget, but to remember, to honor, to ask for forgiveness through the only language his broken hands still knew how to speak. The third day dawned gray, without the violence of the previous night's rain, but with a fine mist that seemed to have invaded not only the morning, but also Elias's eyes. He blinked repeatedly upon waking in the workshop chair, his body stiff from the uncomfortable position, and realized the world had lost its sharpness overnight. The edges of the tools hanging on the wall bled into the surrounding space. Dark spots floated in his visual field like dead insects suspended in amber, and when he sharply turned his head, everything took half a second longer to catch up with the movement. It was happening faster than the doctors had predicted. Elias brought his face closer to the cello in gestation, the rosewood forms mere inches from his eyes. He could still see enough. He still had time. He needed to believe that. The instrument's body was already defined, its sensual curves reminiscent of a female form, the polished wood reflecting the weak morning light with a depth only 40 years of craftsmanship could bestow. But the soul was missing. The F-shaped sound holes were missing, those eyes through which the music would breathe. The elongated neck was missing, the fingerboard where fingers would dance over yet non-existent strings. He gripped the carving knife with both hands to control the tremor. The first incision into the wood released a soft sound, almost a sigh. Elias closed his eyes, letting his fingers guide the way. How many times had he made that movement? 1,000? 10,000? His hands remembered what his mind no longer needed to consciously command. But today his hands also trembled. Today there was fear mixed with muscle memory. Every millimeter of the F-hole needed to be perfect. Too deep and the sound would be muffled. Too shallow and the instrument would never find its voice. The knife slid through the wood in movements that seemed choreographed for decades. But every now and then the tremor overcame the discipline, and Elias had to stop, breathe, restart. Between pauses forced by fatigue and fear, his mind wandered to Helena's letter. He had read it dozens of times in the last 24 hours, the words already memorized, every comma etched into his consciousness like scars. Take care of my Sofia. Teach her to create beauty as you taught me. Don't let her grow up without knowing where she comes from. But he had left. He had left Sofia to grow up motherless, abandoned by a grandfather who couldn't look at her without seeing Helena, without feeling guilt expand within his chest, like a disease parallel to the one consuming his nerves. The first F-hole was complete when the clock on the wall struck noon. Elias stepped away from the workbench, staggered to the old sink in the corner of the workshop, and splashed cold water on his face. When he lifted his head, his reflection in the cracked mirror was a blurred stain, the details of his own face already beginning to slip away. He opened and closed his hands under the water, watching how his varnish and sawdust-stained fingers moved with a will of their own, independent of the deterioration happening in his brain. These hands still knew who they were. They still remembered their purpose. The afternoon was consumed by the second F-hole and the delicate work on the cello's neck. Elias had to bring his face so close to the wood that his nose almost touched the surface, his eyes strained by an effort that produced sharp pains behind his temples. Dark spots in his vision multiplied, floating like crows in an inner sky that progressively darkened. When he finished the second opening, it was already dark outside, and he wasn't sure if it was night or if his eyes were finally beginning to give up completely. It was then that the need to find her became unbearable. Elias dropped his tools and left the workshop for the first time in 3 days. The cold night air hit his lungs with surprising force, making him cough. The street was silent, the old familiar neighborhood now transformed into vague shapes under the deficient public lighting. He walked 3 houses to the left, his legs unsteady after hours of sitting, and knocked on Mariana's door, the woman who had lived there since before Elena was born. Mariana opened the door with a smile that twisted into concern when she saw him. Elias must have looked like a ghost, covered in sawdust, his eyes red from strain, his body bowed like a tree that had survived too many storms. He asked about Sofia, the words tumbling out, almost desperate. And Mariana told him. Sofia lived 3 kilometers away. She worked in a small antique furniture restoration workshop, a discreet place that served museums and private collectors. She was talented, Mariana said with the pride of someone who had watched the girl grow from a distance. She had inherited her grandfather's hands, the patience, the eye for detail that transformed dead wood into resurrected art. Elias felt his legs give way. He leaned on the door frame, the world spinning, not just because of the illness, but because of the brutal irony of the revelation. Sofia had followed the same path. Alone, without guidance, unaware she carried in her blood the same calling that had defined the lives of her grandfather and mother. She had found beauty on her own, in the same long, expressive hands that Elias now couldn't clearly recall in his own memory. And he hadn't been there, not to guide her, not to teach her, not to say he understood. He returned to the workshop in a trance. The cello waited for him on the workbench, almost complete, but suddenly it seemed insufficient. Wood was not language enough for so many years of silence, so many choked excuses, so much love wasted by a man unable to bear his own pain. Elias sat at the auxiliary table where he used to calculate budgets and pulled out paper and a pen. He began to write, the letters emerging crooked from the trimmer and from a vision that now transformed the white sheet into a snowfield smudged with shadows. Sofia, forgive me for... No. Inadequate. Insufficient. He crumpled the paper and started again. My granddaughter. 15 years ago, A lie. Not 15 years ago. 22 years ago. Since she was born and he hadn't known how to love something so fragile without fear of breaking it. More crumpled paper. More attempts. The words seemed to betray him precisely when he needed them most. How to explain that his silence was never indifference, but cowardice? That each day without seeing her was a torture he inflicted upon himself as penance? That looking at her had always been looking at Helena? And that looking at a dead Helena was an abyss he lacked the courage to face? The words did not exist. Not in Portuguese, not in any human tongue. But they existed in wood. Elias put down the pen and returned to the cello. Each curve would be a syllable. Each carving, a word. The final polish, a punctuation mark for silent years. The entire instrument would be his letter, written in the only language his aching hands still mastered with fluency. He worked with an intensity that bordered on violence against his own body. His eyes burned, his temples throbbed, his hands trembled so much that he had to stop every few minutes to force them to obey. But the cello was coming to life. The F-holes seemed to truly breathe. The elongated neck stretched like an elegant neck. The entire structure emanated a grace that transcended functionality. It was not just an instrument. It was a plea for forgiveness, carved from rosewood. It was already past midnight when Elias applied the first coat of varnish. He would need 3 more, perhaps 4, each with drying time between applications. Little time remained. The spots in his vision now covered nearly half of his field of view, and he had to move his head constantly to find the fragments of clarity that still remained. He was applying the second coat, his hands automatic in the circular motion that spread the varnish in thin, even layers, when the knock at the door echoed through the workshop. Sharp. 3 knocks. Definitive. Elias froze. No one visited his workshop at this hour. No one visited him, full stop. Mariana. Unlikely. Some forgotten client from the past? Impossible. He wiped his hands on a cloth already saturated with varnish and sawdust, but only spread more grime. He walked to the door, each step seeming to wade through thick water. He turned the doorknob. He pulled the wood swollen with dampness. The fine rain had started again, an almost invisible drizzle that transformed the street into a blurred watercolor. And there, beneath the weak light of the outdoor lamp, stood Sofia. Elias recognized her not by the details of her face, which his eyes could no longer clearly distinguish, but by her posture, by the way she held her shoulders with the same defensive rigidity Helena had when she was angry, by the shape of her body he knew from photographs obsessively studied over the past 3 days. She wasn't smiling. She held something in her hands, a white envelope that stood out against her dark jacket, and on her face, even through Elias's deteriorated vision, it was impossible not to recognize the expression. Rage, confusion, hurt. She raised the envelope, the abrupt movement of someone accusing, and Elias understood. The lawyer had sent the notice, the inheritance, the property, everything he owned, automatically transferred to his only granddaughter, as he had instructed weeks ago, upon receiving the first diagnosis. A gesture meant to be reconciliation, but which had arrived before the explanation, before the cello, before he could say, through the wood, everything his tongue could never articulate. Sofia was there, finally, after 15 years, and all he had to offer were hands stained with varnish and a silence that now seemed more unforgivable than ever. The workshop door burst open with enough force to make the tools hanging on the wall vibrate on their hooks. Sofia entered as if invading enemy territory, her shoulders tense beneath her rain-soaked jacket, dark eyes flashing with an intensity that made Elias instinctively recoil. She said nothing for a long moment, just watched the old man hunched over the workbench, his hands trembling above a piece of precious wood, and all the rage she had cultivated for 15 years finally found its target. The words began like a river breaking a dam. Sofia spoke of the nights she cried alone after her mother's funeral, waiting for someone to come for her in the cold house of the aunt and uncle who had taken her in out of obligation, not love. She spoke of birthdays without cards, Christmases without a present, the 15 years of absolute silence that made her believe she was invisible, unwanted, forgotten. Her voice rose and fell in waves of accusation, each word sharp and precise, like the tools surrounding them both in that space laden with sawdust and memories. Elias did not move. He remained standing beside the workbench, his hands now hanging limply at his sides like dead weights, his head slightly tilted towards the granddaughter he barely recognized in the fierce young woman before him. Each accusation pierced his flesh like wood splinters under the skin, painful and deserved. He did not lift his eyes to meet hers. He did not try to interrupt her, and he sought no justifications in words he could never properly utter. Sofia walked through the workshop as she spoke, her steps echoing on the uneven wooden floor. She touched the hanging tools, ran her fingers over the faded photographs on the wall, examined the unfinished projects piled high on every available surface. There was something familiar about that space, something that irritated her even more, as if her own body recognized the place in a way her conscious mind refused. She accused Elias of choosing solitude, of embracing grief as if it were a sacred vocation, of turning Helena's death into an excuse to abandon the only living part of her that remained. Sofia's words cut through the heavy air of the workshop for minutes that felt like hours. She spoke of how she learned the craft of woodworking by herself, how she discovered by accident that her hands had a talent for restoration, how every piece she mended was an attempt to rebuild something broken within herself. And she spoke of the shame she felt when colleagues asked about her family, how she had to invent stories to hide the fact that her only living relative had discarded her like a faulty project. Elias absorbed it all in silence, his eyes, already impaired by the disease that was swiftly stealing his sight, fixed on an indefinite spot on the floor. Dark spots danced in his visual field, cruel reminders that time for reparations was running out faster than his trembling hands could work. He did not try to explain that every day of the past 15 years had been a battle against the impulse to go to her. He did not mention the dozens of letters written and torn up, the phone calls planned and never completed, the nights he stood across the street from her school, watching from afar, lacking the courage to approach. Sofia's voice began to grow hoarse, rough with emotion and exhaustion. She spoke of Helena, of how her mother used to describe her grandfather as a man of few words but grand gestures, a craftsman who poured love into every piece he created. Sofia said she spent years looking for that man in her mother's stories, but all she found was a coward who preferred to hide behind wooden walls and musty tools. When he finally fell silent, the quiet that settled in the workshop was different from the one that had preceded it. It was an exhausted silence, stripped of the protection Elias's usual quiet had always provided. Sofia breathed with difficulty, her hands clenched into fists at her sides, her eyes shining with tears she refused to let fall. Elias remained motionless, a monument to guilt and regret. It was then that she saw the cello. Her attention had been so consumed by anger that she hadn't properly registered the object on the main workbench. Now, in the silence broken only by the rain hammering on the zinc roof, Sofia slowly approached the almost completed piece. The polished rosewood reflected the dim light from the lamp suspended above the bench. The curves were perfect, each line flowing into the next with a grace only experienced hands could create. The F-shaped openings in the soundboard revealed an interior crafted with obsessive meticulousness. Sofia reached out but did not touch the instrument. Her eyes, trained by years of working with antique wood, immediately recognized the exceptional quality of the piece. That was not just a cello. It was a masterpiece being coaxed into existence by hands that clearly should no longer be capable of such precision. She noticed the marks of dried blood on some edges, evidence of cuts trembling hands inevitably suffer. She saw the tear stains on the still fresh varnish. Elias watched his granddaughter observe his work. Even through his deteriorating vision, he could see her profile silhouetted against the light, so much like Helena that the pain in his chest intensified until it became almost unbearable. He moved slowly, each step calculated, as if the floor might open beneath his feet. Sofia watched him walk to a corner of the workshop, where a smaller workbench leaned against the wall. He knelt with difficulty, his joints protesting, and pulled a small metal box from beneath the bench. It was rusted at the edges, marked by old burns. Elias held it for a moment before opening it, as if considering one last time if that revelation was necessary or merely another form of cruelty. Inside the box, protected by time-yellowed fabric, lay a single photograph. Sofia accepted the photo Elias handed her, with hands that began to tremble, involuntarily mirroring her grandfather's. The image showed a 7-year-old girl with dark hair tied in uneven braids, holding a varnish brush too large for her small hands. She smiled at the camera with an expression of pure joy, her front teeth missing. Beside her, Helena appeared slightly out of focus, captured in motion as she turned to smile as well, a hand resting protectively on her daughter's shoulder. Sofia recognized that moment, even without consciously remembering it. Something in that image resonated in a deep part of her memory, an echo of happiness from before the world collapsed. She turned the photograph over. On the back, in trembling but legible handwriting, someone had written a date, 3 days before Helena's death. The metal box was empty except for the photo. Sofia looked inside it, then at Elias, then again at the photo in her hands. Understanding arrived slowly, like water seeping into dry wood. That box had survived a fire. Elias could have saved important documents, valuable objects, irreplaceable tools, but he had chosen to save only that. Elias did not explain about the fire that had consumed his old house 2 weeks after Helena's funeral. He did not mention it was intentional, an unsuccessful attempt to destroy the pain along with the memories. He did not say he had entered the inferno of flames solely to rescue that photograph, burning the hands he so treasured in the process. The scars were still there, pale lines climbing his wrists, usually hidden beneath the long sleeves he always wore. Sofia walked slowly through the workshop, still holding the photograph, her eyes now truly seeing the space around her. The floorboards were newer than the rest, installed irregularly as if by inexperienced or damaged hands. The walls bore soot stains beneath layers of fresh paint. She realized she was in a reconstruction, that Elias had raised that place again from the ashes, board by board, nail by nail. The photographs on the wall gained new meaning. They were all of Helena at different ages, many including Sofia as a baby or small child. No photos of Elias himself. No evidence of his own existence, beyond the hands holding tools at the edges of some images. He had built a sanctuary not for his own grief, but to preserve memories he believed Sofia deserved to have, even if she never came to claim them. The anger Sofia had brought with her did not disappear. It still burned in her chest like stubborn embers. But now there was room for something else too. A confusion of emotions she couldn't adequately name. She looked at the unfinished cello, at the photograph in her hands, at the broken old man before her, who offered no excuses because he knew there were not enough. Sofia gripped the photograph more tightly, her fingers trembling in a way that had nothing to do with cold or fear. She recognized that tremor. It was the same tremor she saw in Elias's hands, the same fragility, the same battle against a body that refused to fully obey the will. They were the same hands, separated by decades and silence, but fundamentally identical. She looked back at the reconstructed workshop, at the unfinished projects she now realized were all musical instruments, each one an attempt to create something beautiful from dead material. She understood. She was standing in the same place where that photograph had been taken, in the same space Elias had refused to completely abandon, even after trying to destroy it. The question emerged from a deep place, beyond anger, beyond pain. Her voice came out broken, more vulnerable than she intended, carrying 15 years of misunderstanding. Why had he never sought her out? Why had he chosen silence when words could have built bridges? Why had he let a child believe herself abandoned when he clearly carried her image as his only treasure? The question hung suspended in the air between them, as tangible as the sawdust floating in the lamp's golden light. Elias did not answer immediately. Perhaps there was no answer that could cross the chasm he himself had dug. But for the first time in 15 years, grandfather and granddaughter occupied the same space, breathed the same air laden with varnish and memories, and the impossible possibility of something beyond silence began to take shape in the shadows around them. Elias's voice emerged from deep silence, like old wood groaning under pressure, hoarse and fractured by years of disuse. The words came slowly, each syllable a fragment torn from a place where pain had taken roots so profound that speaking felt like uprooting trees with bare hands. He spoke of the day Helena died, how the world lost all its colors at once, how his body began to betray his commands soon after, his hands trembling first during the wake, then permanently. The disease had a scientific name, neurological explanations, but Elias knew the truth. His body was giving up because his will to continue had died with his daughter. Looking at Sofia in those first days after the funeral was like staring directly into the sun. The girl had Helena's same eyes, the same tilt of her head when confused, the same way of biting her lower lip when holding back tears. Each time Sofia asked for her mother, each time she reached out her small hand for comfort, Elias felt his chest split open like cracked wood. He couldn't breathe near her. He couldn't function. The grief he carried was a poison, something dense and toxic that would contaminate everything it touched. And Sofia had already lost so much. She couldn't also lose her childhood to the adult devouring mourning that consumed her grandfather. So he chose the path of cowardice disguised as sacrifice. He convinced himself that stepping away was an act of love, that leaving Sofia with her father's family would give her a chance to grow without the crushing weight of absence. But the truth Elias now admitted with his voice breaking, was simpler and more shameful. He wasn't strong enough to choose to stay. It was easier to disappear into the workshop, to become a ghost among ghosts, to let the world keep spinning without his participation. The following 15 years were a kind of living death. Elias rebuilt the workshop that had caught fire, erecting new walls over charred foundations, but he never finished any project. He would start tables that would never receive a final finish. He carved chairs that remained eternally missing a leg. He created drawers that never fit perfectly anywhere. Each unfinished object was a way to keep Helena alive, because as long as there was something to do, as long as there was a next step, it meant that time hadn't truly passed. Finishing anything would be admitting that she would never return to see the work complete, that all promises made had turned to dust along with the ashes of that first workshop. The disease advanced slowly, like rust corroding metal. First the trembling hands, then stiffness in the joints, later his vision beginning to fail. Each symptom was a farewell, a piece of himself being torn away in installments. Elias accepted everything with the resignation of someone already dead inside. Until 3 days ago, when the doctor announced that blindness would be complete in less than a week. It was then that something changed. It wasn't hope, nothing so grand. It was something smaller and more urgent. The need to create one last thing that mattered, an object that would carry everything he had never managed to say. The cello was chosen because Helena loved music, because Sofia had the same long hands that could have belonged to a musician, because it was the most difficult instrument Elias could attempt, and he needed it to hurt. He needed each cut to demand everything from him. He needed to bleed into the wood all the regret, all the shame, all the malformed love he had carried alone for so long. The rosewood stored for 15 years was for another project, but nothing had ever been as important as this. When Elias finally fell silent, the quiet that returned was different from before. Still heavy, still laden, but no longer impenetrable. Sofia was crying, silent tears leaving glistening trails on her cheeks beneath the lamp's golden light. The anger was still there, Elias could see, but it was an anger transformed by understanding. Anger not just at him, but at the whole situation, at the lost time, at the pain that had stolen so much from them both. Anger that broken adults make decisions that crush children, that grief can be a choice of destruction. She approached the workbench where the cello waited, almost complete, but still needing the final adjustments that would transform wood into a living instrument. She touched the soundboard with reverence, her fingers tracing the curves Elias had sculpted with the last reserves of his vision. There were visible imperfections, small irregularities where trembling hands had slipped, tool marks not completely smoothed away. But there was also something undeniably beautiful there, something that transcended perfect technique. There was intention. There was desperate love made tangible. Sofia looked at Elias's hands, now resting impotently on the workbench, trembling with that irregular rhythm she finally understood to be the physical manifestation of a pain that never healed. Then she looked at her own hands, young but marked by years of working with antique wood in her restoration studio. They had followed the same path without ever walking it together. They had learned the same language in different schools. They had the same shape, the same long joints, the same tendency to stain with varnish that no soap could completely remove. Without a word, she picked up a fine-grained sandpaper from the workbench and began to smooth an imperfection on the cello's neck. Elias watched for a moment, his eyes already beginning to cloud with that mist that announced the end, then picked up another tool and began to work on another section. They didn't need to coordinate, didn't need to plan. Their hands knew what to do. Their hands remembered what their mouths had never learned to say. They worked through the night, grandfather and granddaughter, side by side, for the first time in 15 years. Elias taught without words, guiding Sofia's hands over imperfections she couldn't see but he could feel. Sofia learned without asking, absorbing knowledge through touch, observation, the muscle memory she discovered dormant in her bones. When Elias's vision completely failed in an area, he closed his eyes and let his fingers see for him. And Sofia became his eyes, describing not with words, but by adjusting his hands so he would understand. The strings were the final challenge, stretched with precise tension that would transform dead wood into something capable of voice. Elias had old strings stored away, preserved with obsessive care, waiting for an instrument worthy of them. His hands trembled too much for the delicate work, so Sofia held his fingers with hers, stabilizing them, creating a temporary unit of 4 hands working as 2. When the last string was adjusted and the bridge positioned, they both stepped back and looked at what they had created together. It wasn't perfect. The sides had slight asymmetries. The varnish was unevenly applied in some spots. The neck had a slight curvature a professional luthier would consider a defect. But it was honest. It was real. It was blood and tears, and 15 years of silence finally transformed into something that could make sound instead of just pain. Elias's vision was almost entirely shrouded in mist now, the world reduced to vague shapes and shifting shadows. He could only see Sofia as a silhouette against the lamp's glow, but he didn't need eyes to know she was holding the cello with the same reverence he had held the rosewood 3 days prior. He didn't need to see to feel that something fundamental had shifted between them. Not forgiveness, perhaps, not forgetfulness, certainly, but something more akin to choice. The choice not to let the dead bury the living with them. Sofia positioned the cello between her knees, took up the bow Elias had prepared with new horsehair, and rested it against the strings. She had never played an instrument before. She had no technique, no training, not the slightest idea what she was doing. But she drew the bow across the central string, and the sound that emerged filled the workshop like water filling an empty vessel. It was a dissonant note, harsh. It was the first breath of something that had been silenced for too long. Elias closed his eyes, not because he could no longer see, but because he didn't need to. That sound was clearer than any image. It was proof that it was possible to take something broken and create music nonetheless. Tears streamed from the corners of Elias's closed eyes as Sofia played that single, terrible, and perfect note repeatedly, each attempt slightly better than the last, learning the instrument as she played it for the very first time. The music was horrible, and it was beautiful, and it was everything either of them needed in that moment. It was beginning, it was end. It was the transformation of burden into gift, of pain into legacy. When Sofia finally stopped, lowering the bow with hands trembling for reasons entirely different from Elias's, the silence that returned was soft for the first time in 15 years. It was not empty, it was full of possibilities, full of the understanding that we carry our dead in many forms, and the choice of how to carry them is the only freedom we truly possess. Elias opened his eyes for the last time in full function, and saw nothing but shadows, But he smiled, a small, broken smile. And Sofia saw in that smile the grandfather she had lost 15 years ago, and the stranger he had become, and the person she might now get to know, since the silence had been broken. It was not complete redemption. It was not a happy ending, but it was real, and it was theirs. And upon the ruins of what had been lost, something new and still unknown began to grow.